The V-2 rocket had to go from a Nazi weapon to a rocket to set the foundation of the space program in the US. Why is it called the V-2? And why is this rocket not only a significant beacon of vintage pop culture, but also how the heck did this German weapon of war end up in the US in the first place? All these answers and more coming up on the next Vintage Retrospekt. Hello and welcome again to Vintage Retrospekt, a cozy 1960s place where I can talk about all things vintage space. The V-2 rocket sets its origins in Germany during World War II under the leadership of Walter Dornberger. But here's the thing though. The V-2 rocket was actually named the A-4 rocket under their rocket program. A-4, which actually stands for Aggregate 4, or also means assembly if using the English connotation. Underneath Dornberger, a German scientist, Werner Von Braun, joined the army in 1932 and was involved in the SS. Braun was offered a promotion that would move him closer to total control of the V-2 program. However, there were some conditions that had to be met, such as joining the SS. Later we will discover how this decision bites him in the ass in 2 decades later. In 1944, the war started heating up with the British forces attacking Berlin relentlessly. The rocket program was fast-tracked and named Vengeance Weapon 2. A propaganda cover to prevent the A-4 name of the rocket from ever cross-contaminating foreign news. And of course, Vengeance Weapon 2 translates into the name we all are familiar with, the V-2 rocket. Testing of this rocket occurred from years 1943 to 1944, before officially being in service. One of the test flights flown on June 20th in 1944 reached an altitude of 174.6 kilometers or 108 miles, which makes this rocket the first to reach space. And the definition of space back then was not recognized as it is today, with the Kármán line set at 100 kilometers. Of course, there was no real sense of urgency to go to space, and it was all about weaponry, so reaching the space part was a bit of a superlative for Germany at the time. So in other words, they reached space, but could care less. But does this mean that the V-2 is a Nazi rocket? Well, to make a short story short, the vehicle was intended with other goals in mind, such as military defense. So the SS is key here. The leader of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, was very interested in the A-4 rocket, and Werner von Braun more or less was just used to further the ill-intended uses of the rocket. You know, a weapon. The V-2 rocket was launched towards Britain and covered a distance of around 200 miles. And the rest of the war story skips over to one pivotal event: the capture of Werner von Braun by the US. Well, it was more of a surrender to the US to avoid capture by Russia. The US Army moved Braun and his work stateside and started his development of the V-2 program at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico starting in the year 1946. With several launches being suborbital and applying scientific instruments, this rocket paved the way forward for multi-stage rockets such as the Bumper V-2 and Vanguard rockets. The rocket was powered by powerful liquid-fueled engines using 75% ethanol alcohol and 25% water mixed, and the oxidizing component, of course, being liquid oxygen. The thrust was rated at 55,000 pounds and had an operational range of 200 miles or 320 kilometers. Altitude-wise, it varied from 88 kilometers to 206 depending on if it was vertically launched or based on a long-range trajectory. The V-2 was probably the most bipolar rocket in history, with its human conflict roots all the way to its foundation of American space exploration. Let's call the V-2 for what it really is. Not a Nazi rocket, but a vintage rocket that went through hell and back. Oh, and by the way, the Soviets had their own V-2 rocket called the R-1. I covered this in my Soviet edition of Vintage Retrospekt, so please go check that out. If you learned more about the V-2 rocket than you did yesterday, please consider subscribing so you don't miss another episode. Also, don't forget that I'm a host on a new spaceflight show over at Orbital Edge News. If you love all things modern space, give us a look. Again, I'm your host, Chad, and I will see you out on the launch pad.